There's a symbol you've seen 100 times if you've spent any time in the Mojave. Almost nobody stops to ask where it came from. A star with a ring around it, stitched onto the flags of the new California Republic, printed on their money, worn on the uniforms of the soldiers who claimed to bring law to the wasteland. Long before the NCR marched east across the Colorado, before the courier ever took a bullet to the head, there were men and women in patched-together armor who called themselves Rangers. They rode the dead highways of the Southwest. They settled disputes with a rifle and a code, and for a while, they were the closest thing the desert had to justice. Then, they were gone. Their name faded out of the record, their territory got swallowed up, and the people who inherited their star mostly forgot the ones who made it mean something. What nobody knew at the time was that the Rangers' origins stretched back further than anyone imagined, to the war that forged the first alliances and set the stage for everything to come. To understand where they came from, you have to go back to the world before, and that world was already coming apart at the seams. By 2077, the oil had nearly run dry, and nations were killing each other over the last of it. The United States had annexed Canada outright to feed its war machine, and American troops were dying in the frozen mud of the Anchorage front against China. The Southwest was a strange place to be alive in those final years. It was crowded with military bases, weapons depots, and the Nevada test site, where the old country had spent decades detonating nuclear devices in the open desert. Corporations like Vault-Tec sold salvation by the ticket, while quietly running experiments on the people who bought in. Ordinary folks felt the squeeze everywhere. Food was rationed, power flickered, and soldiers patrolled the streets of cities that were one bad day from panic. The official story says the bombs came out of nowhere, but the version of the apocalypse the history books tell, that's not how the people who lived it remembered it. It took about 2 hours. That's the number people struggle with. Not 2 hours of warning, not 2 hours of buildup. 2 hours from the first launch to the end of the world, as anyone knew it, on the morning of October 23, 2077. Out in the Southwest, the sky lit up over the military installations that had made the region a target in the first place. The bases, the depots, the test ranges that had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. All of it flashed and vanished. Those close enough never knew it happened. Those a little farther out watched the horizon burn and understood, in an instant, that no one was coming to help. When the shaking stopped and the dust began to settle, a handful of people crawled out from cellars and vaults and collapsed buildings into a landscape that no longer made any sense. The roads led nowhere. The radio was static. Everything they'd been told about the future had ended in a single morning. What comes next is the part that doesn't show up in any official record. The first weeks were worse than anyone had imagined. Radiation sickness hit the survivors in waves, hair falling out in clumps, skin blistering under the ash-heavy sky. The few doctors who'd made it through the initial blast had no equipment, no medication, nothing but basic first aid training for injuries that didn't have names yet. By December 2077, communities that had been 40 or 50 people were down to 12, maybe 15. Starvation killed more than the radiation did. Pre-war laws, property rights, the idea that someone could own a well or a storehouse, all of it dissolved the moment food ran out. A sheriff's badge meant nothing because the man wearing it was dying of thirst. The Mojave became a patchwork of isolated camps, each one convinced they were the last humans left alive. Trade routes didn't exist. Communication didn't exist. What existed was the gun you could hold and the shelter you could defend until morning. Winter of 2078 was colder than any on record, and half the survivors who'd made it through the bombs froze in makeshift shelters that wouldn't hold heat. But in that void, one group had something the others didn't, a plan that predated the bombs themselves. Scattered across Nevada and into Arizona, There were survivors who'd brought more than luck with them. Engineers from Hoover Dam who knew how to coax electricity from rusted turbines. Ex-military like Army, Marines, and National Guard who remembered logistics, patrol patterns, how to organize a perimeter. Small-town sheriffs and highway patrol officers who'd spent careers keeping order in places where order was all that stood between civilization and chaos. These weren't settlements built on scavenging and prayer. They were methodical. In a town outside what used to be Searchlight, a former civil engineer named Sarah Chen spent 3 months mapping every water source within 20 miles, calculating flow rates, building filtration from car parts and sand. Near the old Nevada-Arizona border, a Marine Corps sergeant named Marcus Webb trained 17 civilians in fire discipline and squad tactics, using broomsticks because ammunition was too precious to waste on drills. By 2080, maybe 30 of these communities had stabilized, not thriving, but alive. They had crops that yielded something, walls that held, a rotation of guards who knew which end of a rifle to point at the raiders, testing their defenses every few weeks. What they didn't have was communication with each other, a way to share what worked and what got people killed. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains how a handful of survivors became an army. Spring of 2082, a trader named Elliot Cross made a circuit through 11 settlements carrying the same message. Meet in Las Vegas, or what was left of it, last week of April. No weapons inside the gathering point. Bring your best people. 43 representatives showed up. Community leaders, militia captains, anyone with authority that still meant something to the people they protected. The meeting took place in a half-collapsed casino basement, lit by oil lamps. For 6 hours, they compared notes, and the pattern was impossible to ignore. Raiders weren't just scavengers anymore. They were coordinating. A group hit near Good Springs one week would show up 40 miles east the next. Same tactics, same insignia carved into the bodies they left behind. The settlements were reacting, always one step slow, while the raiders were planning. A former Arizona Ranger named Robert Hale put it plainly: "We either organize now, or we die in pieces over the next 5 years." The vote wasn't unanimous. 3 settlements wanted nothing to do with a centralized force, thought it would just become another gang. But 40 agreed. They would pool resources, train together, share intelligence. Mutual defense modeled on pre-war law enforcement, with military discipline to make it stick. What they called themselves would become a legend, but the name itself, that came from somewhere far darker. The name came from history, from a tradition older than the bombs. The Texas Rangers had been frontier lawmen when the frontier was still wild, and the Southwest had its own legends of men with badges who kept the peace at gunpoint. These survivors wanted that same authority, that same fear and respect, so they borrowed it wholesale. Desert Rangers, 2 words that said everything about who they were and what they claimed. They wore long dusters to keep the sand off, carried rifles scavenged from armories and dead soldiers, and every one of them pinned a star to their chest. The star was the important part. It meant you answered to something bigger than yourself, that you'd enforce laws even when it cost you. In a world where most people barely remembered what government looked like, that star carried weight. It said this person won't run, won't take bribes, won't look the other way. Whether that was true depended on the ranger wearing it, but the symbol did its job. But wearing a badge in the wasteland meant painting a target on your back, and the first test came sooner than anyone expected. 2083, a ranger patrol, 8 men strong, picked up tracks near the Hoover Dam ruins. Raider convoy, maybe 20 strong, hauling stolen water and supplies south from what used to be a settlement. The Rangers had 2 choices: let them go or make a statement. They set up an ambush in the dam's spillway tunnels, waited until the convoy was bottlenecked, then opened fire. Precision shots, No warning, no negotiation. 3 raiders dead in the first volley. The rest scattered, abandoned the loot, and ran back into the Mojave. The Rangers loaded the supplies onto Brahmin, returned them to the settlement, and kept moving. Word spread fast. There were men in dusters enforcing something that looked like law, and they shot first. More patrols followed, more ambushes, more raiders who learned the hard way that the desert had teeth again. Within 6 months, raider activity in Ranger territory dropped by half. What nobody realized was that this one skirmish set a precedent that would define the faction for a century. They needed rules, something written down so every ranger knew what the star meant. The code came together over weeks of arguments in Nevada firelight. Protect settlements that ask for protection. Punish raiders and slavers without mercy. Enforce contracts between communities when both sides agree. Simple enough to remember, rigid enough to keep order. Internal discipline was harsher. A ranger who stole faced expulsion at minimum, execution if it happened twice. A ranger who abandoned his post or his patrol got the same. The code said you died before you retreated, before you let civilians get hurt, before you let raiders win. That expectation killed plenty of good men, but it built a reputation nothing else could. The Rangers became their code. You didn't join for money or safety. You joined because you believed the wasteland needed something better than survival. Settlements started flying makeshift flags when patrols passed through. Kids pretended to be rangers with sticks and bottle caps. And for a brief stretch of years, it felt like civilization might actually claw its way back. But the code had a shadow side, one that wouldn't surface until the Rangers had real power. By 2085, the Rangers had mapped out a protection circuit that covered most of southern Nevada and crept into northern Arizona. Good Springs, Prim, Searchlight, a dozen smaller settlements that paid tribute in Brahmin meat, scavenged ammunition, and whatever pre-war gear could still fire. It wasn't taxes, not officially. You gave what you could afford, and in return, Ranger patrols came through every 2 weeks, like clockwork. The Mojave stabilized in a way no one had seen since before the bombs. Caravans ran routes without losing half their guards to raiders. Water pumps stayed functional because someone actually showed up when bandits tried to sabotage them. Settlements started keeping written logs again, tracking harvests and births instead of just counting the dead. The Rangers didn't govern, they just made governing possible. They'd arrest a murderer, turn him over to the settlement council, and ride out the next morning. No courts, no jails of their own, no interest in who got elected mayor. For 5 years, that worked. What comes next is the moment everything changed, not from outside, but from within. 2091. A ranger named Hollis stood up during a council meeting in Searchlight and asked a question no one had wanted to say out loud. If we're the only thing keeping these people alive, why are we taking orders from farmers who've never held a rifle? If we enforce the laws, shouldn't we be the ones writing them? The room split down the middle. Half the Rangers believed their job was protection, not rule. You patrol, you intervene, you leave. The moment you start making laws instead of enforcing them, you're not a ranger anymore. You're a warlord with better PR. The other half thought that was idealistic garbage. Settlements were fragile, councils were corrupt or incompetent, and real safety required control. The debate went on for months. No votes, no resolutions. Just the same argument in different outposts with different faces. Both sides had followers. Both sides believed they were protecting the code. The tension didn't explode. It just sat there, getting heavier every time a patrol came back and had to decide whether to advise a settlement or overrule it. The question of who the Rangers were really serving wouldn't be answered with words. By 2092, the philosophical split had become geographic. The Northern Rangers, operating out of Nevada and into Southern Oregon, held the line on the old model. You protect, you don't rule. Settlements govern themselves. Rangers enforce agreed-upon laws, and if a council makes a bad call, that's their problem to fix. Voluntary tribute, voluntary cooperation, no standing army. The Southern Rangers, concentrated in Arizona and the edges of New Mexico, went the other direction. Tribute became taxes, collected on schedule with consequences for refusal. Councils were replaced with ranger-appointed administrators. Patrols turned into occupations. They still called themselves rangers, still wore the duster and the star, but the code had twisted into something else. Safety through order, order through power. Two factions, same name, same origins, different futures. The Northern Rangers watched their brothers become the thing they'd sworn to prevent. The Southern Rangers believed they were the only ones taking the wasteland seriously. For a year, they coexisted in cold silence, each side waiting to see if the other would collapse or prove them right. But before that divide could tear them apart, a common enemy appeared that made their internal war look trivial. By 2094, the raider problem had evolved. Where once you had scattered gangs hitting caravans and homesteads, now you had warlords carving out territories. The Vipers controlled the eastern Mojave with a religious fervor that made execution look like worship. The Jackals ran the northern wastes like a pack of feral dogs, given guns and a taste for human flesh. And in the west, the 80s tribe, the gang that would one day become the Great Khans, operated with a level of organization that looked uncomfortably close to what the Rangers were trying to build. These weren't bandits anymore. They had supply lines, training camps, hierarchies. The Vipers alone numbered over 200 fighters, with outposts spanning 90 miles of highway. They raided settlements not for survival, but for expansion, taking slaves, stockpiling weapons, pushing boundaries, and they saw the Rangers the same way the Rangers saw them, as competition for water, land, and the future of Nevada. The raids escalated through 2095. A Ranger outpost burned in March. A Viper camp got razed in May. By summer, both sides were losing people weekly, and the pattern was clear. This wasn't going to stop with a truce or a border agreement. One side was going to break the other, or both sides were going to bleed out trying. What the raiders didn't understand was that they just unified the one faction that could destroy them. The War Council convened in September 2096 at a neutral station 40 miles south of Las Vegas. 11 Northern Rangers, 9 Southern, and agenda with exactly one item: stop arguing about philosophy and start killing raiders. The meeting lasted 6 hours. By the end, they had an armistice, a joint command structure, and a 3-year operational plan that read more like an extermination contract than a military strategy. The terms were brutally pragmatic. Northern Rangers would handle logistics, medicine, and civilian protection. Southern Rangers would lead combat operations and interrogations. Disputes about the code would be tabled indefinitely. Personal grudges would be set aside, or you'd be expelled. The vote passed 18-2. Within a week, Ranger patrols that hadn't spoken in a year were coordinating ambushes and sharing intelligence on raider movements. It wasn't reconciliation, it was a ceasefire built on mutual necessity and the understanding that internal politics were a luxury you couldn't afford when someone was burning your settlements. The Southern faction got what they wanted: a Ranger force willing to do whatever it took. The Northern faction got what they needed: enough manpower to survive, and the Raiders got something they hadn't planned for: 200 unified fighters who'd spent a year learning how to think like killers. What followed was the bloodiest decade the Mojave had ever seen, and the Rangers wrote the rules of engagement. The Viper campaign opened in January 2097 with a coordinated strike on 4 camps simultaneously. The Rangers didn't take prisoners that day. They didn't issue warnings. They torched the camps, poisoned the wells with Brahmin carcasses, and executed anyone who couldn't run fast enough. By March, the Vipers had lost 60 fighters and 2 major strongholds. By June, they'd stopped raiding and started retreating. The Rangers pursued them with a methodical cruelty that would have horrified the northern faction 3 years earlier. Captured Vipers were interrogated for supply routes, then hanged as warnings. Camps were burned even after they'd been abandoned. Water sources the Vipers relied on were sabotaged with radiation or chemicals. It was scorched earth in the most literal sense, a campaign designed not to defeat an enemy, but to erase them from the map. By late 2100, the Vipers were finished as a Mojave power. The survivors scattered west into California, a broken cult with no home and no future. The Rangers had won decisively, and the other raider clans saw the message: you either left Nevada or you died in it. Settlements celebrated. Caravans ran routes that had been suicide missions 4 years earlier. The Mojave, for the first time since the bombs, felt like it might have a future. But the victory came with a cost nobody wanted to acknowledge, at least not yet. By 2102, the Rangers were holding 14 settlements and maybe 3,000 square miles of desert. They'd won the war, but they were learning that victory just trades one set of problems for another. Every town they protected expected patrols, dispute resolution, defense against the next threat. In return, the Rangers collected tribute, food, ammunition, recruits. Not everyone was happy about it. Some settlements saw it as protection money, with extra steps. Others argued the Rangers had earned it, that without them the Mojave would still be bleeding out. Inside the faction, the old debate flared up again. Were they peace officers or a standing army? Protectors or governors? The leadership tried to avoid the question. They had no charter, no constitution, just the code, and a lot of tired men holding too much ground. Settlements kept asking for more Rangers. The Rangers kept asking for more supplies. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but they were starting to look less like lawmen and more like something else entirely. Pay attention to this next part, because it's where the Rangers made the choice that would define their end. Between 2105 and 2110, the Rangers expanded south into the ruins of what used to be Southern California, and west into the salt flats of Utah. It wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. Towns heard about the Viper campaign, saw the trade routes opening up, and asked to join. The Rangers said yes, over and over. But saying yes meant building the infrastructure to back it up. They established the first permanent Ranger forts, supply depots every 80 miles, recruitment offices in 6 major settlements. Caravans ran scheduled routes with Ranger escorts. They started training classes of 20 recruits at a time, instead of taking whoever wandered in. The whole operation was starting to look professional. By 2110, there were roughly 400 active Rangers, and maybe twice that many auxiliaries, scouts, and support staff. They controlled territory from the Mojave to the Colorado River, north to the edges of Old Nevada, south nearly to the Boneyard. It was the largest organized faction in the western wasteland, and it ran on tribute, oaths, and the reputation of 50 exhausted veterans who'd killed the Viper Kings. What they didn't see coming was that they were building the infrastructure someone else would inherit. 79 years later, in 2189, a town called Shady Sands held an election. The people chose a man named Aradesh as their leader, and he did something almost nobody in the wasteland had tried. He wrote a constitution. He called it the New California Republic, and he modeled it on the old America, the one from before the bombs. The NCR wasn't built on oaths or tribute. It was built on votes, laws, and the idea that people could govern themselves if you gave them the structure to do it. Shady Sands had clean water, Brahmin herds, and a militia that answered to elected officials instead of warlords. Within 10 years, 3 nearby towns joined voluntarily. Within 20, the NCR had a functioning Congress and a tax system. It was hundreds of miles west of Ranger territory, growing quietly in the shadow of Vault 15 and the Hub. The Rangers had never heard of it. The NCR had heard rumors about the Desert Rangers, but they were busy building roads, drafting agricultural policy, and arguing about term limits. Two factions, two visions of what civilization could look like in the wasteland, both expanding into the same desert. But the two factions were on a collision course, and neither knew it yet. For 40 years, the Mojave belonged to the Rangers. From 2110 to 2150, the desert was as close to safe as the wasteland gets. Caravans ran on time. Settlements grew into towns. A whole generation was born, lived, and died without ever seeing a raider attack, make it past the outer perimeter. The tribute system hummed along quietly. 15% of crops, some scrap metal, the occasional pre-war artifact. In return, ranger patrols kept the roads clear and the slavers running scared. Towns like Shady Sands and Junktown didn't have walls because they didn't need them. The rangers were the walls. It wasn't peace, exactly. More like a very long ceasefire, enforced by people with revolvers and a reputation. But for a generation that had only known chaos, it felt like paradise. Kids grew up hearing stories about the bad old days, not living through them. The Rangers had won, and everyone knew it. No one wrote songs about it. No one built monuments. It was just 40 years of quiet competence, of problems solved before they became crises, of a system that worked so well, people forgot it was there. What comes next is the moment the Rangers' luck ran out, and it started with something they couldn't shoot. In 2151, the Colorado River started to fail. Water levels dropped 40% in 18 months. Wells that had sustained communities for decades went dry in weeks. Crops withered in fields that had been green since before the war. The Mojave had always been a desert, but now it was dying. Settlements that paid tribute in grain couldn't grow grain anymore. Towns that relied on aquifers watched them turn to mud, then dust. By 2153, the tribute economy the Rangers had built their power on was collapsing. People started moving west, not raiding, not fleeing violence, just packing up and walking toward rumors of water in California. Whole towns emptied out in a month. The Rangers could protect a caravan from bandits, but they couldn't protect a well from geology. Patrols rode past abandoned settlements, empty corrals, fields gone to bone-dry dirt. By 2155, the Rangers were still the most feared fighting force in the Southwest. They just didn't have anyone left to protect. The tribute stopped coming because there was nothing to tribute. The settlements that remained were hanging on by recycled sweat and prayer. But the drought exposed a deeper problem the Rangers had been ignoring for decades. The Ranger Command in the mid-2150s was a council of men in their 60s and 70s, veterans of the Viper campaigns, the Unification Wars, the Golden Age. They'd built the system. They'd made it work. And now, as everything crumbled, they refused to change a single piece of it. Younger Rangers saw what was happening. They pushed for water reclamation tech salvaged from vaults, permanent bases with cisterns and irrigation, centralized supply lines, shared resources, something that looked less like a tribute network and more like a government. The old guard shut them down every time. We're Rangers, not bureaucrats. We patrol, we protect. That's the code. So the patrols kept riding, even as the towns they were protecting ceased to exist. Meetings stretched for days, arguments going in circles, while settlements bled population, and the few that stayed stopped paying. The Rangers had spent 40 years being the best at what they did. No one had taught them how to be anything else. By 2156, the paralysis was obvious to anyone paying attention. The Rangers couldn't adapt, couldn't pivot, couldn't even agree on whether there was a problem. They'd won the wasteland with bullets and grit, and now they were losing it to inertia and pride. What nobody wanted to say out loud was that the Rangers were becoming obsolete, and someone was watching. In 2062, NCR scouts crossed into the eastern Mojave for the first time. They came with radios, maps, and a mandate to explore, not conquer. The first meetings were cordial, almost formal. Rangers traded intelligence on raider movements. NCR officers offered pre-war textbooks and medical supplies. But both sides walked away unsettled. The Rangers saw something they didn't have words for: a functioning government with taxes, elections, a constitution, people who called themselves citizens instead of survivors. The NCR scouts, meanwhile, filed reports describing a militia held together by reputation and old rifles, with no legal framework, no succession plan, no central authority. The Rangers had won the wasteland by being harder than everyone else. The NCR was winning California by building something people wanted to join. Neither side said it out loud, but the comparison was already happening. Every caravan driver, every settlement elder, every ranger who saw an NCR patrol in clean uniforms started doing the math. What the Rangers saw as curiosity, the NCR saw as opportunity, and the clock started ticking. In 265, representatives from both sides met in a trading post 40 miles south of Hoover Dam and signed the first formal treaty: non-aggression, shared intelligence on raider activity, open trade routes through Ranger territory. On paper, it looked like a partnership between equals. The document was 11 pages long. Most of it was standard wasteland diplomacy, the kind of agreement you'd expect from two powers dividing a map. But buried in Section 7 was a clause about future cooperation in matters of mutual security and regional development, language so vague it could mean anything. The Ranger delegates who signed it thought they'd secured independence. The NCR negotiators thought they'd just written a lease with an option to buy. Nobody argued about the wording, because nobody wanted to admit what they were really negotiating: whether the Desert Rangers would still exist in a decade. But even as they signed, both sides were calculating the same question: who would control the Mojave in 10 years? By the late 2160s, settlements across the eastern Mojave were making a comparison the Rangers couldn't win. NCR offered citizenship, not just protection; infrastructure investment, not just patrols; courts that settled disputes with paperwork instead of bullets. The Rangers had kept people alive. The NCR was offering them a future. Towns that had paid tribute to the Rangers for 30 years started asking questions. What do we get for that tribute, besides occasional patrols? Can the Rangers build a school, pave a road, guarantee our kids won't grow up pointing rifles at raiders? The ideological gap was wider than the geographical one. The Republic believed in laws, expansion, manifest destiny over the wasteland. The Rangers believed in sovereignty, self-reliance, and the right to be left alone. One was selling a dream of civilization. The other was defending a way of life that looked more and more like just survival. What comes next is the thing the Rangers feared most: not an invasion, but a choice. It started with a single town in 2170, a settlement called Dayglow that the Rangers had protected for 15 years, raised an NCR flag in the town square, and told the next Ranger patrol they weren't needed anymore. Within a year, 3 more communities did the same. By 2173, it was happening monthly. The process was almost always identical. A town council would vote, sometimes unanimously, to petition for NCR membership. The flag would go up, and when the Rangers arrived on their regular circuit, they'd be met at the town limits by armed militia, local men the Rangers had trained, who politely but firmly turned them away. The Rangers couldn't fight back without proving the NCR's entire argument for them. You can't protect people at gunpoint from a choice they've already made, so they watched their territory shrink, settlement by settlement, while the maps in their headquarters got redrawn every few months, with new borders they couldn't enforce. But the real blow came from inside the Rangers themselves. in a form nobody expected. By the mid-2170s, a faction had formed among the younger Rangers, men and women in their 20s and 30s, who'd grown up watching the NCR expand. They started saying out loud what a lot of people were thinking. The Ranger model wasn't sustainable. It never had been. They argued that 200 men couldn't protect 50,000 square miles forever, that the NCR offered schools where Ranger kids could learn to read, hospitals with real medicine, courts where disputes got settled by law instead of whoever had the faster draw. Everything the Rangers couldn't provide and never would be able to. The old guard called it betrayal. These were Rangers, sworn to defend the organization that had kept the desert alive for 80 years. But the young faction kept pushing, kept organizing, kept making their case in the common rooms and around campfires. The arguments got heated. Then they got personal. Then they stopped being arguments. What nobody realized was that this internal debate was being watched very carefully from shady sands. In 2076, NCR President Wendell Peterson sent a formal letter to the Desert Rangers Command Council. It wasn't a demand or an ultimatum. It was an invitation. The Desert Rangers were invited to join the new California Republic as full citizens with complete integration into the NCR military structure. The terms looked generous on paper. Every Ranger would receive NCR citizenship, rank equivalent to their current position, and full military benefits. Ranger traditions would be preserved. The name would continue. The star badge would still be worn. Families would get land grants, medical care, education for their children. Everything the young guard had been asking for. But there was a condition that ran through every paragraph like a thread. The Rangers would surrender their independent authority. They'd answer to NCR command. Their jurisdiction would be defined by the Republic's borders, not by need or tradition. They'd become a branch of someone else's military. What the old guard saw as surrender, the young guard saw as survival, and the faction tore itself apart. The Civil War lasted 3 years. Pro-NCR Rangers took Fort Mojave in June 2177, fortified it with NCR supplies, and dared the old guard to try and take it back. The traditionalists held Ranger Station Echo and the desert outposts, running patrols like nothing had changed. By winter, former brothers were shooting at each other over water rights. It wasn't a war with battle lines. It was sabotage, ambushes, supply caches poisoned or burned. A Ranger named Clayton died in his sleep at Station Charlie, shot by someone he'd trained. Another, Martinez, walked into the Mojave and never came back. The forts emptied out one funeral at a time. By 2180, neither side had won. They'd just run out of people willing to kill someone who wore the same star. The outposts sat half-staffed, the patrols stopped running, and the desert went quiet. But while the Rangers bled themselves dry, the Mojave was left unguarded, and something ancient was waking up. The tribes came back fast. The Sorrows reclaimed Zion Canyon. The dead horses pushed into the eastern routes the Rangers used to patrol. Remnants of the great Khans, scattered since Bitter Springs, saw the vacuum and moved in. Without the Rangers holding the line, the Mojave reverted in 18 months. Settlements that had stood for decades burned. Caravans stopped running the northern routes after 4 went missing in a month. Towns like Good Springs and Prim locked their gates and hoped someone else would handle it. The traders who'd relied on Ranger protection started hiring private guns, and most of those guns were worse than the raiders. By late 2180, the Mojave looked like it had before the Desert Rangers existed. Tribal law, raider territory, no safe roads. The Civil War had cost the Rangers their authority, their numbers, and their credibility. What comes next is the moment the Rangers realized they'd lost, not the war, but the purpose. The treaty was signed at Hoover Dam on March 12, 2181. Both sides came armed. The old guard stood on one side of the table, 47 rangers, who'd held the desert for 80 years. The NCR delegation stood on the other, flanked by troopers in full kit. Nobody put their guns down. The terms were simple. The Desert Rangers would disband as an independent organization and integrate into the NCR's military structure. They'd keep the title, keep the coat, but the star would be reforged. NCR Ranger, not Desert Ranger. The old faction ceased to exist the moment the ink dried. Some of the old guard walked out and never came back. Others stayed, told themselves it was the only way to keep the tradition alive. The Ranger star was melted down and recast with the NCR bear stamped beneath it. 104 years of independence ended in a ceremony that took 11 minutes, but the treaty had a clause nobody read carefully, and it would haunt the NCR for decades. Article 7, subsection 3. Original Desert Rangers retained operational autonomy within NCR structure. They answered to Ranger Command, not NCR military brass, not civilian governors. The NCR got the name, the symbol, the manpower. But the chain of command had a break in it. It meant a Ranger could refuse an NCR general's order if it contradicted Ranger doctrine. It meant Ranger resources stayed under Ranger control. It meant the Desert Rangers became a state within a state, wearing NCR colors but operating by their own code. The treaty drafters thought it was a minor concession to ease the transition. By 2180, NCR bureaucrats were finding out what it actually meant. Rangers requisitioned supplies without paperwork. They deployed without clearance. They reported when they felt like it. And legally, there was nothing the Republic could do. What the NCR thought was assimilation was actually a compromise, and the old Rangers knew it. The 2180s brought the culture clash nobody planned for. NCR issued standardized armor, standardized rifles, standardized patrol routes. The Desert Rangers kept their dusters, their revolvers, their instinct for the wastes. Forms went unsigned. Radios went unanswered. The bureaucracy tried to file the Rangers into neat columns, and the Rangers just kept walking. But the institution was changing anyway. Every year, fewer of the original Desert Rangers remained. The recruits filling Ranger ranks now were NCR-born, NCR-raised, trained in the old ways but loyal to the new flag. Veteran Rangers taught them to track, to shoot, to survive without supply lines. The skills transferred. The independence didn't, not fully. By 2190, the Desert Ranger identity had thinned to something you could see through. The name survived, the star survived, even the reputation survived. But the men who'd held Arizona against raiders and warlords were dying off, and their students had never seen the territory the Rangers died for. But while the institution survived, the territory the Rangers died for was slipping away. 2247, Arizona. A man named Edward Sallow walked out of the wastes with a new name and an army behind him. Caesar, the Legion, 86 tribes pacified, enslaved, or slaughtered in 4 years. The speed was terrifying. The brutality was systematic. And it was happening exactly where the Desert Rangers had once ruled. The Legion swept through towns the Rangers had defended for generations. Prescott, Flagstaff, the Painted Desert, all fell in months. There was no organized resistance, no unified militia, no one who knew the terrain well enough to mount guerrilla operations. Just scattered settlements and tribal bands that broke under the first assault. If the Desert Rangers had held their territory, the Legion would have hit a fortified line with 100 years of desert warfare knowledge behind it. Instead, Caesar found a vacuum. By the time NCR scouts brought word of the Legion back west, it controlled more land than the old Ranger territories ever had. What the NCR didn't understand yet was that they'd inherited the Rangers' war, but not their knowledge of the terrain. The NCR's Mojave campaign began in the 2270s, and on paper it looked like reclamation. Settlements that had been ranger outposts before the treaty got repopulated. Supply lines extended east from California, and military engineers surveyed Hoover Dam like they'd found the Holy Grail. By 2274, the NCR flag flew over the dam, and President Kimball was already planning his victory tour. But the locals didn't see liberation. They saw taxes on Brahmin, conscription quotas, and NCR bureaucrats explaining why their water rights now belonged to California farmers 300 miles west. Towns that had survived raiders and death claws on their own for decades suddenly needed permits to repair their own walls. The Mojave had been empty long enough that people forgot what control felt like. The NCR treated it like virgin territory, but it wasn't. Every fort they rebuilt had a foundation laid by rangers. Every trade route they secured had been mapped by rangers. They were walking in footprints they didn't recognize, claiming ground that still remembered who'd bled for it first. But the real problem wasn't the settlements. It was the one man who'd been waiting for this moment. Robert House woke up in 2138, 77 years after the bombs fell, in a stasis chamber beneath the Lucky 38 casino. His body was ruined, his city was rubble, but his mind was intact, and his plan was already 200 years long. He'd saved Vegas from total annihilation in 2077 with a missile defense grid, and now he'd save it from history itself. By 2274, his Securitron army controlled the Strip. He'd rebuilt 3 casinos, evicted the tribes squatting in the ruins, and turned New Vegas into the only place in the wasteland with clean streets and electric lights. House didn't want to join the NCR or fight them. He wanted sovereignty, a city-state immune to the failures that killed the old world. The NCR could have the dam and the desert. He'd keep the jewel. It was a calculated neutrality, backed by robots and a 200-year-old genius who'd beaten nuclear fire once already. The NCR couldn't take Vegas by force without a war that would cost more than the city was worth, and House knew it. He held the center of the Mojave, and he wasn't moving. What comes next is the convergence. 3 factions, 1 city, and the ghost of the Rangers caught in the middle. The first battle of Hoover Dam hit in 2277, and it wasn't a skirmish. Caesar sent 4 cohorts straight at the dam under Legate Joshua Graham, the Malpais Legate, a former Mormon missionary who'd become the Legion's most brilliant tactician. The NCR had engineers and artillery. The Legion had 1,200 men willing to die on command, and a general who understood terrain like he'd been born in it. For 5 hours, the Legion pushed the NCR back across the dam's eastern roadway. NCR troopers broke ranks twice, and only emergency reinforcements from Camp Golf kept the line from collapsing entirely. Then, First Recon arrived. 40 snipers, descendants of Ranger tactics if not Ranger blood, dug into the cliffs and started dropping Legion officers at 400 yards. Graham's command structure shattered, and the cohorts retreated east into the burning wreckage of their own camp. The NCR held the dam, barely, and declared it the greatest victory in the Republic's history. President Kimball gave speeches, officers got promotions, and Hoover Dam became the symbol of NCR expansion into the Mojave. But the victory came with a casualty nobody expected: the last link to the original Desert Rangers. The man who watched it all slip away was Chief Hanlon, veteran of the first Hoover Dam battle, commander of the NCR Rangers, and one of the last officers who'd actually served alongside original Desert Rangers before the Unification Treaty. He remembered what they stood for, what they fought for, and how it ended. By 2281, Hanlon was stationed at Camp Golf, coordinating Ranger operations across the Mojave. On paper, he commanded the most elite fighting force in the NCR. In practice, he was watching history repeat itself. The NCR was overextended, bleeding troops and supplies into a desert they didn't understand, holding territory out of pride instead of strategy. Hanlon saw the pattern. The Desert Rangers had done the same thing, spreading themselves thin across Arizona and Nevada, fighting a war they couldn't win until exhaustion forced them to accept annexation. Now, the NCR was making identical mistakes, just with more troops and worse logistics. He'd won the first battle of Hoover Dam through tactics and terrain knowledge. He knew the second battle would be different. What Hanlon knew, and couldn't say, was that the war was already lost, just like the Rangers' war had been. The proof was in the outposts. Ranger Station Alpha in the north, watching the road to New Vegas. Bravo near Nelson, monitoring Legion movements across the Colorado. Charlie on the western edge. Delta in the hills. Echo guarding the approach to Hoover Dam itself. 5 stations, maybe 40 Rangers total, holding a frontier that stretched across hundreds of miles. Each station was undermanned, undersupplied, and expected to hold territory the NCR couldn't afford to lose, but wouldn't properly reinforce. The Rangers at Charlie were watching Cazador nests and Deathclaw migration routes, with equipment that should have been replaced 2 years ago. Echo had sightlines on the dam, but no artillery support. Bravo was close enough to Legion camps to hear their war drums at night. These weren't the Desert Rangers of old, but they were fighting the same fight. Small teams in hostile territory, making do with what they had, buying time for a government that kept promising reinforcements that never arrived. The difference was that the original Rangers eventually realized they couldn't win alone. The NCR Rangers were still waiting for orders that made sense. But while the Rangers held the frontier, the real power was consolidating behind them, and they had no idea. October 19, 2281. A courier took a job delivering a poker chip to the New Vegas Strip. Standard run, decent pay, hired by a client through the Mojave Express. The route went through Good Springs, a quiet settlement northwest of Primm. The courier never made it. A man in a checkered suit was waiting at the Good Springs Cemetery with 3 hired guns. His name was Benny, chairman of the Tops Casino, and he wanted what was in that package: the Platinum Chip, a pre-war data storage device that unlocked systems under the Lucky 38 casino. Benny shot the courier twice in the head, took the chip, and left the body in a shallow grave. Except the courier didn't die. A Securitron named Victor dug them up. A doctor named Mitchell patched the bullet wounds, and somehow the courier walked out of Good Springs with brain damage and a reason to find Benny. No faction was watching. The NCR was focused on the dam, the Legion on their invasion plans, Mr. House on his calculations. Nobody registered that a wild card had just entered the game. What nobody could predict was that this one person would force every faction to confront what the Desert Rangers never resolved: who rules the wasteland? By late 2281, the Mojave had become a loaded gun, with 4 people reaching for the trigger. Caesar's Legion was massing at Cottonwood Cove, 8,000 troops in staging camps east of the Colorado. The NCR had 6 major outposts stretched thin across the territory, supply lines running 400 miles back to California, troopers exhausted from constant skirmishes. Mr. House sat in the Lucky 38 calculating probabilities, his Securitron army hidden beneath Fortification Hill, waiting for the exact right moment to reveal itself. The courier walked those same roads, solving problems nobody else could touch, brokering truces between the Khans and NCR, shutting down fiend operations in Vault 3, finding the missing Ranger Morales at Nipton's ruins. Each action shifted the balance in ways the big factions couldn't track. Hoover Dam generated 4.2 billion kilowatt-hours a year, and whoever controlled it would own the future of the West. The NCR knew it, the Legion knew it, House knew it. Every faction had committed everything to the coming battle, and nobody was backing down. But before the final battle, there's one more Ranger story that needs telling, the one the NCR buried. Scattered across the deep Mojave, in caves and abandoned homesteads the maps don't show, live the holdouts. descendants of desert rangers who refused the 2271 treaty, who watched their comrades put on NCR uniforms and called it betrayal. 30, maybe 40 of them still out there, keeping the old star on their armor, maintaining the original ranger stations as shrines. They remember the stories their grandparents told about the days when rangers answered to the communities, not to politicians in shady sands. They watch NCR rangers patrol Highway 95 and see collaborators wearing stolen valor. Some are old enough to have served under the star themselves before the unification, nursing 38 years of bitterness in the dark. The NCR classified them as non-hostile remnants in internal memos, a problem too small to waste resources on. General Oliver never visited their camps, never heard them explain why the treaty was a surrender dressed as partnership. Colonel Moore wrote them off as bitter relics clinging to a dead past. What the NCR never understood was that you can't kill an idea with a treaty, and the Ranger's ghost was about to walk again. Chief Hanlon sat in his office at Camp Gulf, listening to casualty reports from the eastern stations, and made a decision that would have gotten him executed in wartime. He began falsifying radio intelligence, editing reports before they reached General Oliver. Ranger deaths exaggerated by 40%. Legion strength inflated. Strategic positions reported as compromised when they were holding fine. His logic was cold and military precise. The NCR had overextended into territory it couldn't hold, repeating the same expansionist mistakes that destroyed the old world. Every week in the Mojave cost 12 Ranger lives on average, defending a dam 400 miles from home for a government that treated them as expendable assets. If he could make the campaign look hopeless enough, High Command would order withdrawal, save the Rangers, let the Mojave sort itself out. It was treason, technically. It was also the act of a man who'd spent 52 years watching good soldiers die for bad orders, who remembered when Rangers served people instead of flags. Hanlon knew exactly what he was doing and accepted the cost. But Hanlon's plan depended on one thing, that nobody would force the NCR to commit fully, and somebody just did. By late 2281, the Legion began moving siege equipment toward Hoover Dam. Legate Lanius had assumed command of the entire Eastern Front, and the reports coming back to Camp Gulf were grim. The Legion wasn't raiding anymore. They were positioning for a total assault. NCR reinforcements were trickling in, but nowhere near fast enough. General Oliver had 700 troopers at the dam itself, another 400 scattered across ranger stations and forward camps. The Legion had at least 2,000 combat-ready legionaries massing at Fortification Hill, with more arriving every week. The Rangers knew the math. They'd held the dam once with better numbers and the element of surprise. This time, they had neither, but they dug in anyway, reinforced the sniper nests, stockpiled ammunition, and waited. What comes next is the choice the Desert Rangers never got to make: who the Mojave belongs to. 4 possible outcomes. 4 completely different futures for the Mojave, and for the men and women wearing the Ranger Star. If the NCR wins, the Rangers become permanent fixtures of the Republic's military, the Unification Treaty's autonomy clause quietly forgotten. If the Legion wins, every Ranger at Hoover Dam dies. The stations are overrun, the survivors crucified along Highway 95. Caesar's military doesn't leave loose ends, and he's got a particular hatred for the NCR's symbols. If Mr. House wins, the Rangers become irrelevant overnight. The Securitron army doesn't need backup, and House has no interest in frontier justice or protecting caravans outside New Vegas. The Mojave becomes his city-state. Everyone else just lives in it. And if the courier takes the dam for themselves, the Rangers' fate depends entirely on one person's decision, a wastelander who showed up 6 months ago with a bullet scar and no allegiance to anyone. But there's one outcome nobody talks about, the one where the Rangers' legacy actually survives. If the NCR wins, the victory parade in Shady Sands lasts 3 days. President Kimball declares the Mojave the Republic's 6th state. General Oliver gets a promotion, and the Desert Rangers, quietly, cease to exist as anything separate. The Unification Treaty's autonomy clause is formally revoked in 2282, 9 years after it was signed. Every ranger becomes an NCR ranger. No distinction, no independent command structure. The bases stay open, the armor stays the same, but the chain of command runs straight to Shady Sands now. Some of the old guard retire rather than accept it. A few just disappear into the wasteland, taking their dusters and rifles with them. But most stay, because the work still matters, even if the flag's different. The Mojave gets roads, taxes, courts, electricity. It gets safe. It gets civilized. The dream of independent frontier justice, the idea the Rangers fought for since 2271, dies for good in the paperwork. But in that ending, there's a detail most people miss, and it explains why some Rangers chose differently. If the Legion takes Hoover Dam, every Ranger dies. Not in battle. After. The captured ones get crucified along Highway 95, spaced exactly 1 mile apart from Boulder City to Searchlight. 47 crosses in the first week. The Legion doesn't distinguish between NCR Rangers and Desert Rangers. To them, it's all the same heresy. They burn the ranger stations, execute anyone wearing the duster, and hunt down retirees in their homes across Nevada and California. The records at Camp Golf go into a pyre. The statue at the Veterans Memorial gets torn down and melted. By 2282, there's no physical evidence the Rangers ever existed. No monuments, no archives, no living witnesses. The Legion erases 11 years of NCR Ranger history and 111 years of Desert Ranger history in 6 months of systematic purges. But even in that darkness, the Ranger Code survives in one unexpected place. If Mr. House wins, the Rangers don't die. They fade. House doesn't need frontier lawmen when he's got 9,000 Securitrons enforcing order on the Strip and patrolling Freeside. The treaty he negotiates with the NCR is polite, but it doesn't include provisions for Ranger presence in the Mojave. Camp Golf closes in 2282. The outposts along Highway 95 shut down by 2283. Rangers retire or transfer back to California, and the NCR doesn't replace them because House's robots do the job cheaper and faster. No one's crucified, no one's dishonored. The tradition just becomes irrelevant. By 2285, there are no active Rangers in Nevada. The duster hangs in closets, the big iron rusts in gun safes, and the old Desert Rangers who joined in 2271 die knowing their legacy ended not in fire, but in obsolescence. The wasteland moves on without them, efficient and cold. But there's one ending left, the one that brings the Rangers full circle. If the Courier claims independence, the Rangers' fate depends entirely on one person's decision. The NCR gets pushed out of the Mojave, and the Courier inherits a power vacuum, a broken dam, and a region full of people who've been living under military occupation for 4 years. Some couriers let the NCR Rangers leave with the retreating army and never look back. The outposts go dark, the roads get dangerous again, and the Mojave returns to the lawless frontier it was before 2274. Other couriers do something different. They recruit the Rangers who refuse orders to retreat, the ones who'd rather stay and finish what they started. In that version, the Desert Rangers return, not as an NCR division, but as an independent force answering to the Mojave itself. They patrol without a government behind them, enforce justice without a Senate's approval, and carry the big iron like it's 2271 again. The circle closes after 111 years. What the original Rangers never knew was that their story wouldn't end with them. It would end with one person's choice a century later. The original code was 3 sentences long. Protect the settlements from raiders and animals. Punish those who take advantage of the weak. Enforce contracts between settlements. That was it in 2160, and every faction standing over the Mojave Dam in 2281 thinks they understand what it meant. The NCR reads it as law enforcement with a badge and a manual of procedures. The Legion reads it as weakness, soft hearts playing civilization while history demands iron. House reads it as a quaint artifact, heroism rendered obsolete by actuarial science and missile defense systems. An independent courier might read it as prophecy, the wasteland calling for someone to do what governments won't. But every interpretation misses the structure underneath. The code doesn't say who the Rangers answer to, doesn't define settlement or contract, doesn't explain what happens when protecting one group means threatening another. It's 3 sentences holding 120 years of history, and the weight broke them twice already. But the code was never about factions. It was about something deeper, and that's what most people miss. Justice in the wasteland is a bullet through a slaver's skull at 200 yards. It's also a noose around a horse thief's neck in a town square. It's a ranger walking 40 miles to settle a water dispute, or a squad executing raiders who turned out to be refugees. The definition changes with the witness, and the Rangers tried to be the constant in that equation. They built their answer from proximity and violence. Show up where law doesn't exist, decide who lives and who dies, move on before anyone asks who gave you that authority. It worked in 2160 because the settlements were 6 families and the raiders were 12 psychopaths. By 2241, the settlements were towns, the raiders were armies, and the Rangers were 80 people trying to hold back history with lever-action rifles. The mission was impossible from the start. You can't enforce justice without power, can't hold power without becoming what you fought, can't stay small and stay relevant when nations rise. They knew it. Hanlon knew it. Every Ranger who put on the duster knew it. They tried anyway, because somebody had to. And that choice is the only thing that made them different from every other gang with guns. What comes next is the part of the story nobody wanted to admit. The Rangers failed. But maybe failure was inevitable. The Desert Rangers failed because they couldn't evolve past what they were. 67 years from founding to absorption. And they never built a training academy, never wrote a procedure manual, never answered whether they served the people or ruled them. They stayed a warband with good PR, and warbands don't survive contact with republics. Their virtues killed them. Independence meant no chain of command when coordination mattered. Martial skill meant they solved every problem with violence until violence stopped working. Frontier pragmatism meant they never planned past the next season, never built institutions, never asked what happens when we're gone. The NCR absorbed them in 2271 because the alternative was extinction, and extinction doesn't negotiate. The same pattern repeats in the Mojave. The NCR Rangers inherit the name, the coat, the reputation, and in 10 years they're stretched across 400 miles of desert playing speed bumps for the Legion. Hanlon sees it, the chief sees it, every veteran Ranger sees it. You can't be 200 Spartans when the enemy brings 20,000 soldiers, and the thing you're defending is a bureaucracy that measures you in casualty reports. But before we close the book on the Rangers, there's one last piece of the story, and it's happening right now. In 2281, if you walk far enough into the Mojave backcountry, you might still meet someone wearing a star. No NCR backing, no radio check-ins, just a weathered coat and a code they learned from a dead organization. These aren't official Rangers. Most of them never even met one. Some are ex-NCR who couldn't let it go. Others found a badge in a locker, heard the stories, and decided that's what they'd be. A few are genuine, protecting caravans, settling disputes, keeping raiders off the roads. Others are just enforcers with a myth to hide behind, dispensing frontier justice that looks a lot like revenge. They operate alone or in pairs. No chain of command, no accountability beyond whatever conscience they brought with them. One group in Nevada still patrols the old routes near Shady Sands. Another operates out of a bunker in Arizona, hunting slavers. They don't coordinate. They don't even know each other exists. But they all carry the same legend, the same half-remembered code about protecting the innocent and making the wasteland safer. What they represent is the thing the NCR could never kill, the idea that law in the wasteland doesn't come from governments. There's a cave in Zion Canyon, hundreds of miles east, where another kind of ranger left his mark. Randall Clark never wore the star. He was a park ranger before the bombs, then a soldier, then just a man alone in the canyon for 50 years. Clark watched tribes come and go. He protected the ones who needed it, killed the ones who preyed on the weak, left supplies in hidden caches, and wrote it all down in scattered logs across Zion. His final entries read like the Ranger Code, written by someone who never heard of the Desert Rangers. Protect the innocent, punish the wicked, leave something better behind. He called himself the Father, a ghost the tribals worshipped without ever seeing his face. When he died in 2096, the Sorrows inherited his gear, his weapons, and the idea that someone watches over them. Clark spent half a century trying to be judge, protector, and executioner for people who didn't ask for it. The Desert Rangers tried the same thing with entire states and lasted 30 years before the weight crushed them. Both legacies end the same way. One person can't fix the wasteland, and neither can 200. But Clark's legacy survived in the Sorrows, and maybe that's the answer the Rangers never found. The Ranger legacy doesn't live in one place. It scatters. The NCR Rangers carry the name and the armor, but Hanlon's conspiracy and the body count at Hoover Dam turned the institution into something the originals wouldn't recognize. Bureaucrats in dusters filing reports between sniper missions. Hanlon himself becomes the legacy's cautionary tale, the man who believed so hard he falsified intelligence to save lives, risking treason because the code said protect the innocent, and the NCR kept feeding Rangers into a meat grinder. The survivalists in the Mojave carry the myth forward, rewriting it with every choice, some righteous, some brutal, none with oversight. And then there's the courier. Depending on your path at Hoover Dam, you either hand the Rangers to Caesar as trophies, lock them into NCR's grinding war machine, bury them under House's corporate Vegas, or set them loose in an independent Mojave with no nation to serve. Every ending reshapes what the Rangers meant. The story doesn't end, it mutates. Every person who picks up the star adds something, distorts something, keeps the idea alive, even as the reality fades into campfire stories and half-remembered oaths. What comes next is the reckoning, what the Rangers actually accomplished, stripped of myth. Start with the numbers. Over 150 years, the Desert Rangers killed thousands. Raiders, sure. Tribals who wouldn't negotiate. Dissidents who challenged the wrong patrol at the wrong time. The Mojave got stable, and stability came at the end of a rifle. No one kept a ledger. No one memorial lists the names of every scavenger shot on sight. Every camp burned out because it looked hostile. The Rangers didn't operate under courts or oversight. They were judge, jury, and executioner in a place where those roles hadn't existed for 200 years. Here's the tension. Was it necessary violence or a self-perpetuating war machine? You can argue the Mojave needed that iron fist to survive the early decades. You can also argue that once you build an organization around killing threats, every problem starts looking like a threat. The Rangers didn't answer to anyone, so no one could tell them when to stop. But the body count only tells half the story. The other half is what they built. Trade routes first. The roads between settlements didn't appear by accident. Ranger patrols cleared them, marked them, kept them safe enough that caravans took the risk. By 2100, you could move goods from the boneyard to New Vegas without losing half your crew to ambush. Outposts became towns. A ranger station needed water, walls, a place to stable Brahmin. Traders set up nearby. Farmers followed. 50 years later, you've got Shady Sands, and the Rangers are just the guys who started the whole thing by planting a flag and saying this ground is ours. The intangible part matters more. The Rangers introduced the concept of law, not tribalism, not might makes right, but rules that applied whether you had a gun or not. They weren't perfect at it. They bent their own rules constantly. But the idea took root. People started expecting that someone would enforce order, that justice wasn't just a pre-war fantasy. What nobody expected was that the Rangers' greatest legacy wouldn't be what they built. It would be who they inspired. By 2281, the NCR Rangers are the institutional descendants, elite troops, recruited from the best the Republic can field. They wear the same dusters, carry the same brush guns, pin the same star to their chests. If you see one on the Strip or patrolling the Long 15, you're looking at 150 years of tradition, folded into one soldier. But they serve the Republic, not the frontier. They take orders from generals in Shady Sands, deploy where the Senate votes, protect Brahmin barons as often as settlers. The old Rangers answered to no one. These Rangers answer to a bureaucracy with taxes, elections, and a Senate that's never seen the Mojave. The tension lives in every patrol. You're wearing the symbol of frontier independence while enforcing the will of a government that stretches from the boneyard to the Colorado. Some NCR Rangers lean into the Republic side. They're soldiers first, legends second. Others hold tight to the old code, the idea that the star means something older than flags and paperwork. But there's one Ranger who bridges both worlds, and his choice defines what the legacy means. Chief Hanlon spent years feeding falsified reports up the chain, softening casualty numbers, downplaying the losses along the Colorado. He did it to slow the war, to save his Rangers from being spent like ammunition on a front the NCR couldn't hold. But the wasteland has a way of pulling threads loose, and if a courier finds the truth, Hanlon knows exactly how the story ends. Exposed, he doesn't run. There's no trial that saves him. No version where the man who lied to protect his people walks away clean. He can face a firing squad, or he can put a rifle under his own chin in the Mojave outpost, quiet, the way he always operated. And that's the tragedy of it. The last man who still carried the old Desert Ranger conscience gets destroyed by the very Republic those Rangers chose to join. What Hanlon understood, and the NCR didn't, was that you can't institutionalize the wasteland without killing what made it worth saving. So consider the star. To the original Desert Rangers, that little metal shape meant law where there wasn't any. A promise that somebody would ride out to the settlements nobody else remembered. It was earned in blood and honored in dust, and it never needed a government behind it to mean something. To the NCR, the same star became a badge of the elite, stitched onto the best soldiers the Republic could field, a mark of status you trained years to wear. And to the people scattered across the sand, it split in two. For some, it's the shape you're glad to see coming over the ridge. For others, it's the last thing a Legion scout sees before the shot lands. That's the strange life of a symbol. It outlasts the people who made it, and becomes whatever the living need it to be. But symbols don't hold territory, and territory is what the Rangers fought for. So what actually happened to their land? When the annexation settled and the paperwork dried, the original Desert Rangers didn't simply vanish. Some hung up the star and took quiet jobs in the growing Republic, sheriffs and instructors and old men on porches who'd seen the desert before it had borders. They'd gotten the peace they wanted, more or less, and it tasted a little like surrender. Others drifted west into NCR territory and watched the thing they built get renamed, reorganized, folded into a bureaucracy that filed their legends under regulations. They didn't complain loudly. That wasn't the Ranger way. But you could hear it in how little they talked about the merger, the way people go silent around a subject that still aches. A few carried that quiet bitterness to the grave, certain they'd traded the soul of the outfit for a seat at somebody else's table. But one Ranger never stopped fighting the war the others had abandoned. Josephine Hernandez walked out of Camp Golf in 2272 with her old Desert Ranger duster rolled up in her pack and never reported to her NCR assignment. Marcus Vellum disappeared from the Mojave outpost 3 weeks after the merger, leaving his locker empty except for a note that said, "Gone home." Over the next 2 years, 14 former Desert Rangers quietly vanished from NCR rosters, declared AWOL, or deserters, their files stamped and forgotten. They surfaced in caravan reports as ghosts. A ranger matching Hernandez's description pulled a family out of a raider ambush near Searchlight, refused payment, and walked back into the desert. Vellum's signature rifle turned up in stories from traders along the 95, always the same pattern: bandits dead, goods untouched, no one around to thank. NCR Command wrote them off as drifters clinging to a dead identity, wastelanders playing dress-up in surplus gear. But the sightings kept coming, too coordinated to be random. A cache of pre-war medical supplies appeared outside a settlement the same week raiders burned their clinic. Gun runners found ammunition and spare parts waiting at dead drops they'd never used. Always the right caliber, always when supply lines ran thin. Someone was still working the routes, still protecting the corridors, still operating like the Rangers had never stopped existing. What nobody knew was that they'd been coordinating the entire time. The network ran on pre-war radio frequencies the NCR had never bothered to monitor, short bursts of coded traffic that sounded like static to anyone without the cipher. Dead drops rotated every 6 weeks, locations marked in ways only Desert Rangers would recognize. A certain stack of rocks, a specific tree with blazes cut at knee height, the old trail signs from before the bombs. By 2275, 11 former Rangers were sharing intelligence across 4 states, passing information the NCR either couldn't see or chose to ignore. They tracked Legion movements 3 months before NCR scouts reported them. They mapped raider migrations, identified slavers operating under trader cover, and documented which settlements would hold and which would fold when pressure came. Hernandez ran the southern routes from the Divide to the Colorado. Vellum held the northern corridors, and a third operative, name unknown, worked deep in Legion territory, sending back reports written in blood price tallies. They stored weapons, medicine, and ammunition in hidden caches scattered across the Mojave, marked on maps that existed only in memory. It wasn't rebellion, not exactly. They paid their taxes when they passed through NCR territory, stayed clear of military operations, never fired on Republic soldiers. But they also didn't report to anyone, didn't follow orders, and built an organization that answered to nothing but the old Ranger code. The question they kept asking each other was simple: what comes after the NCR falls? Every message on the network carried the same assumption. The Republic was overextended, undermanned, and running on momentum it no longer had. The math was brutal and simple. NCR held territory from the Boneyard to the Colorado, a supply chain stretched across 700 miles of hostile desert, with 3 major highways and 12 settlements large enough to matter. The Legion controlled twice the land, with half the infrastructure, and Caesar didn't need to win. He just needed to wait for the NCR to collapse under its own weight. The holdouts prepared for that collapse like it was scheduled on a calendar. They buried weapons in the kind of locations you'd want if civilization ended tomorrow. Near water sources, defensible positions, routes that connected settlements without passing through NCR checkpoints. Hernandez alone maintained 8 caches between Nipton and Novak, each one stocked for 6 months of independent operation. The network compiled lists of people who could be trusted, people who'd survived without the Republic before and would survive without it again. They weren't trying to save the NCR. They were building the skeleton of what came next, a framework that could hold the Mojave together when the flag came down and the garrisons pulled back to California. It was cold pragmatism dressed up as loyalty, the kind of planning you only do when you've accepted the outcome and moved on to damage control. By 2281, the signs were already visible to anyone who knew where to look. The NCR had pushed too far, too fast. By 2278, their supply lines ran 400 miles from the hub to the Colorado River, threading through raider territory, deathclaw nests, and land so empty that a single ambush could starve an outpost for weeks. Hoover Dam was supposed to solve everything, unlimited power and water for the whole republic. But holding it meant garrisoning 4 locations simultaneously while fighting a war on 3 fronts. Back in the core region, the corruption had metastasized. Senators were selling water rights to their own constituents. Military contracts went to the lowest bidder, who happened to be somebody's cousin, and the tax revenue that should have been feeding troops was vanishing into private accounts in the boneyard. The Mojave campaign was costing 41% of the defense budget by 2280, and they hadn't gained an inch of ground in 18 months. Rangers in the field were getting resupply drops with ammunition that didn't match their weapons, rations 6 months past expiration, and requisition forms that took 90 days to process. The brass kept promising reinforcements that never came because there were no reinforcements. The NCR had committed every available soldier, and they were losing them faster than they could train replacements. But the real fracture wasn't in the Mojave. It was back home. The Brahmin barons had always been influential, cattle and caravan magnates who'd bankrolled the NCR's expansion since the 2240s. But by the late 2270s, they weren't influencing policy anymore. They were writing it. 6 families controlled 73% of the arable land in NCR territory, owned the water treatment plants, and held enough debt markers on Senate votes to kill any bill they didn't like. They wanted the Mojave for the same reason they wanted everything else: monopoly. Hoover Dam meant water rights, New Vegas meant trade routes, and the rangeland east of the Colorado meant expansion space their herds desperately needed. So they kept the war funded, just enough to bleed slowly, because a long war meant long contracts, and long contracts meant guaranteed profit, whether the NCR won or lost. The republic that had been built on Aradesh's dream of mutual protection and democratic governance had turned into a plutocracy with a flag. Laws got passed in back rooms over Brahmin steaks and whiskey. Soldiers died holding indefensible positions because retreating would hurt quarterly earnings. And the people who'd given everything to build the NCR were being taxed into poverty to pay for a war that only enriched the already wealthy. The old Rangers had been watching, and they'd made a decision. It started small, the kind of mistakes that happen in any supply chain stretched too thin. A fuel depot in Dayglow burned down in June 2279, cause unknown, right before a major convoy was supposed to launch for the Mojave. An intelligence report on Legion troop movements went missing for 3 weeks, just long enough for the window to close. Ammunition shipments got rerouted to the wrong outposts. Water purification tablets arrived broken, and radio encryption keys were leaked to locals who suddenly knew when patrols were coming. Nobody could prove anything, because the veterans doing it had spent 40 years learning how to make things look accidental. They were ex-Rangers, old desert Rangers who'd taken the bear reluctantly and never really forgiven the annexation. They weren't sabotaging the war effort to help the Legion. They were sabotaging it to collapse the overextension before it dragged the entire Republic down with it. It was surgical, precise, and completely deniable. A caravan ambush that could have been raiders, a bridge failure that could have been age, a supply clerk who retired early and took his filing system with him. The NCR kept pushing east, kept bleeding resources, and kept wondering why everything that could go wrong did go wrong at exactly the worst possible moment. By 2281, the Ghost War had cost them more materiel than the Legion had destroyed in combat, and nobody in Shady Sands even knew it was happening. What comes next is the part that still divides historians. The holdouts met in a bombed-out ranger station 40 miles west of Searchlight in March 2281. 11 veterans, average age 53, all of them carrying pre-war Desert Ranger badges. They'd never surrendered. The question on the table was simple. Could they justify killing Aaron Kimball to save the NCR from itself? Half the room said no. They'd spent 40 years watching the Republic turn their oath into a marketing campaign, but murder was the line they wouldn't cross. The other half pointed to the casualty reports, the overextension, the slow collapse of everything the original Desert Rangers had died to protect. Kimball's expansionism was going to destroy the NCR. Removing him might save it. The argument went for 6 hours. No vote was ever taken. 3 men walked out and didn't come back. The rest agreed to table the discussion for 2 weeks, reconvene at a different location, and decide then. They never got the chance. In the end, they didn't have to decide. Someone else did it for them. Between April and July 2281, President Kimball survived 4 separate assassination attempts. A sniper at Camp Golf missed by 8 inches. A bomb at Boulder City was defused 90 seconds before detonation. A poisoned meal at McCarran was caught by a food taster who spent 3 days in a coma. And then Hoover Dam, where the entire security apparatus nearly failed. NCR intelligence blamed Caesar's Legion for all of it. The Legion claimed credit for 2 of the 4. Internal Affairs suspected a conspiracy inside the military. Hanlon's reports mentioned possible Ranger involvement, but provided no names. Every agency had a theory, and none of them matched. What nobody could explain was the precision. These weren't desperate amateurs. The sniper at Golf used a rifle chambered in .308, military grade, and knew exactly which tent Kimball would be in 20 minutes before he arrived. The Boulder City bomb was rigged with NCR-issue detonators. Someone with deep knowledge of NCR protocols was feeding information to someone with the skill to use it. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that followed. In September 2282, a courier working for the Followers of the Apocalypse found a data slate in a dead drop near Westside. It contained 14 months of encrypted communications between 3 former Desert Rangers and a Legion Frumentarius named Vulpes Inculta. They hadn't planned the assassinations. They'd provided intelligence, patrol schedules, security gaps, supply routes, troop movements, everything the Legion needed to bleed the NCR dry. The justification was written in the final message. They weren't traitors, they claimed. They were accelerationists. The NCR had become a corrupt expansionist machine that would collapse under its own weight within a decade. Better to force the collapse now, on their terms, than let it drag the entire Mojave down with it. Better to reset the board than watch the Republic rot from within. The data slate made it to Shady Sands 6 weeks later. NCR intelligence verified the encryption keys. The names were redacted before the report went public, but within Ranger circles, everyone knew. 3 men who'd worn the star for 30 years had fed information to Caesar's Legion, not because they believed in the bull, but because they thought burning the bear was the only way to save what it used to stand for. The question became, were they still Rangers, or had they become something else entirely? Their reasoning was clinical. The NCR had expanded beyond the boneyard, past the hub, all the way to the Colorado. It taxed communities that never asked to be citizens, conscripted farmers to die holding a dam they'd never benefit from, and shipped resources back west while the frontier starved. In their view, this wasn't the Republic anymore. It was the old world in different clothes, and the Rangers had become its enforcers. They believed Caesar's legion would burn through the Mojave like a wildfire, consume the NCR's overextended supply lines, and collapse under its own weight within a generation. What would be left, they argued, was a power vacuum. No taxes, no occupying armies, no bureaucrats deciding which towns deserved protection. Just communities figuring it out for themselves, the way it was before Shady Sands decided manifest destiny was back in style. The math was simple in their heads. A few thousand dead now to prevent a few 100,000 enslaved later, when the NCR inevitably became what every government becomes: desperate, authoritarian, willing to sacrifice anyone outside the core territories to keep the machine running. They saw themselves as the only ones honest enough to make the call. What they didn't account for was how many people would die in the process. Bitter Springs happened on April 5, 2278. First Recon got bad intelligence. A con raiding party camped in the canyon, maybe 40 fighters, an easy target. They opened fire at dawn. It wasn't a raiding party. It was a civilian convoy, elders and children fleeing NCR expansion, and by the time the shooting stopped, the body count was 37 non-combatants. The official report blamed fog of war, bad recon, the chaos of frontline engagement. But there were inconsistencies. The intelligence packet that reached Camp Gulf 3 days before the operation listed the con encampment as a civilian group, then was amended 18 hours later to reclassify them as hostiles. The amendment was filed from a terminal inside Ranger Station Charlie, a facility with exactly 6 active users at the time. No formal investigation was ever opened. The massacre was politically useful, a tragedy that justified harsher crackdowns on the cons and tighter control over the Mojave. Some officers suspected the intelligence had been manipulated, that someone inside the Rangers fed false targeting data to First Recon, knowing exactly what would happen. If true, it wasn't sabotage. It was a demonstration, proof that the NCR's hands were already too bloody to wash clean. The version you've heard about Ranger innocence, that's not the full picture. Chief Hanlon ran the Mojave Rangers from Camp Gulf for 6 years. He read every after-action report, signed off on every intelligence summary, knew which terminals were used and by whom. If the Bitter Springs data was altered internally, it passed through his chain of command. The question isn't whether he saw the discrepancies, it's whether he understood what they meant. There's evidence he did. In 2281, 3 months before the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, Hanlon began falsifying patrol reports, overstating Legion strength and Ranger casualties to convince the Senate that the Mojave campaign was unwinnable. He called it mercy, a way to force a retreat and save lives. But colleagues noted he never questioned the intelligence failures that led to Bitter Springs, never pushed for an audit, never asked why 3 decorated Rangers all had terminal access during the same 48-hour window. He was caught between 2 impossible truths. If he exposed the collaborators, he'd destroy the Rangers from within and hand Caesar a propaganda victory. If he stayed silent, he became complicit in their crimes, complicit in Bitter Springs, complicit in every death that followed. So he did what broken men do. He tried to end the war his own way, through lies and falsified data, hoping that pulling the NCR back would stop the bleeding before anyone else had to make the choice he refused to. In his last days, he made one final decision about the truth. Hanlon filed his final report on October 9, 2281, 6 days before the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. 47 pages, typed on a pre-war Remington in his office at Camp Golf, documenting 14 months of intelligence fabrication across 9 Mojave operations. He listed every falsified casualty count, every exaggerated Legion strength assessment, every report he'd doctored to make the war look unwinnable. What he didn't include was the full Bitter Springs chain of command. He named himself, named the intelligence failures, but left the interrogation transcripts out of the file. The Rangers who'd tortured con prisoners for troop movements, the officers who'd greenlit the massacre knowing women and children were in that canyon, all of it stayed buried in a separate folder he burned the same night. His confession was a careful thing. Enough truth to damn himself. Enough omission to protect the institution he'd spent 52 years building. He signed it, sealed it in an envelope marked for President Kimball's eyes only, and put a bullet through his head before anyone could stop him. The NCR classified it immediately, but one copy survived. 3 young Rangers found it in a filing cabinet at Camp Golf during the post-battle cleanup, November 22, 81. Stella Chen, 24, Ranger for 3 years. Marcus Oren, 27, 5 years service. David Ramirez, 22, barely 18 months in the duster. They read it in a supply tent by candlelight and understood they'd been lied to about everything. Not just Hanlon's sabotage, the whole mythology. The Desert Rangers had been violent expansionists who'd massacred civilians. The Unification Treaty was a land grab dressed up as brotherhood. Bitter Springs wasn't an accident, it was doctrine, and their heroes had known. Chen left the NCR 6 weeks later. Oren made it 4 months before he walked off a patrol and never came back. Ramirez stayed the longest, 2 years, trying to reform it from inside, until he realized the institution didn't want reform. By 2284, all 3 were gone, along with 17 other young Rangers who'd seen that report, or heard the whispers. They scattered into the wastes, carrying questions nobody in the NCR would answer. Some of them went looking for the original Rangers' descendants. The bloodline was thinner than anyone expected. By 2285, researchers tracked down 34 confirmed descendants of the first Desert Rangers scattered from the Boneyard to New Reno. Tribal leaders who'd never heard the name. Caravan guards who knew their great-grandfather wore a star, but not why. A Brahmin rancher in Redding whose grandmother's duster hung in a closet, bullet holes still in the leather. Most had fragments, a code phrase about protecting the weak, a half-remembered story about the Ranger unification. One family in the hub kept a journal from 261 written by a Ranger who'd refused to sign the treaty, who'd walked away into the desert rather than join the NCR's army. He'd written 140 pages about what the Desert Rangers were supposed to be before the war, before the expansion, before they became legends. The ideological inheritors were easier to find. Wasteland drifters who lived by the old code without knowing its name, protecting settlements for nothing but food and a place to sleep. They weren't soldiers. They were what the Rangers had been in 2082, before the glory, before the myth took over and turned protectors into conquerors. In 2289, someone tried to bring them all together one last time. The meeting happened in the Tops Casino basement, 11 people around a table that still had bullet holes from the second battle. 6 were descendants of original Desert Rangers, carrying their grandparents' badges and stories. 5 were ex-NCR Rangers who'd walked away after Hoover Dam, some dishonorably. The descendants wanted to reclaim the name, rebuild the organization as it was in 2082. Independent protectors, no flags, no nation. The NCR veterans said that ship had sailed in 2271 when the Unification Treaty was signed, that you can't unring a bell or pretend 50 years of history didn't happen. Angela Navarro, granddaughter of an original Ranger, laid out a manifesto, 12 principles, all centered on one idea: communities first, never governments. Marcus Chen, who'd been at Bitter Springs, called it naive fantasy. He said the wasteland had changed. that warlords and legions don't negotiate with 12 people carrying good intentions. The argument went in circles for 8 hours. Every compromise proposal hit the same wall. Who decides which communities deserve protection? And who pays for it when caps run out and supplies don't materialize? By dawn, half of them had left. The other half made a pact. They called themselves the Mojave Rangers, careful to avoid the legal mess of using desert or NCR. The manifesto got printed on 200 flyers, distributed in Freeside and Westside. They set up in an old fire station in North Vegas, 6 people with hunting rifles and pre-war ranger armor that didn't quite fit. For 4 months, it worked on a small scale. They mediated water disputes, tracked down a kidnapped caravan merchant, cleared out a raider nest near Sloan. No payment demanded, just donations of food and ammo. By month 5, they'd recruited 8 more, mostly young wastelanders who'd grown up on stories of what rangers used to be. Then the reality set in. The NCR sent a cease and desist, threatening arrest for impersonating military personnel. The followers of the apocalypse, who'd been quietly supplying medical gear, withdrew support after political pressure from Shady Sands. Caravans stopped donating because the Crimson Caravan Company undercut anyone who did. By 2292, they were down to 4 people operating out of a tent, taking shifts as caravan guards just to afford ammunition. The manifesto was still pinned to the wall, but nobody was reading it anymore. Within 2 years, it was over, but not for the reason you'd expect. The Hoover Dam power vacuum had triggered something old. Tribes that had coexisted under NCR, or Legion occupation, started settling pre-war scores. The Scorpions moved on Vault 3, the Vipers raided Westside, and 3 smaller groups whose names nobody remembers went to war over a water treatment plant in Prim. The Mojave Rangers tried to stay neutral, offering to mediate. They brokered 2 temporary ceasefires in early 2293. But mediation only works when both sides want peace more than they want blood. The third conflict was different. The Firebrand tribe versus the remains of the Great Khans, fighting over territory near Red Rock Canyon. The Rangers walked into the middle of it trying to negotiate, and the Firebrands opened fire. Not on the Khans, on the Rangers. They saw them as NCR collaborators, traitors who'd helped destroy independent tribes for a decade. The Khans didn't defend the Rangers. They waited to see what would happen. Marcus Chen made the call. The Rangers returned fire, killed 6 Firebrands, and helped the Khans secure the canyon in exchange for safe passage. It was a tactical decision, a survival choice. It was also the end of everything they'd tried to build. The moment they chose a side, they stopped being Rangers. Within 6 months, the Rangers existed only as a name carved into different flags. The Twisted Hares claimed 14 Rangers loyal to their territory. The Vipers held 9. The Jackals had 7, though 3 of those had never served under the original code. Each group enforced their own version of justice. Twisted Hare Rangers protected caravans that paid tribute and turned away those that didn't. Viper Rangers executed thieves in their territory, but ignored slavers passing through to neutral ground. The code that once applied to everyone now bent to match the flag you served. By 2253, no ranger could patrol beyond their faction's borders without being shot on sight by another ranger. The universal ideal died in pieces, fragmented across clan lines that meant more than the oath. The title survived, the meaning didn't. But one person still carried the original code, word for word. Sarah Reese was 61 when the partition happened, the only ranger who'd served under both the Maxon and Elise eras. She walked out the day the vote passed and never answered to a faction again. For 19 years, she traveled alone, settling disputes in towns too small for NCR courts and too remote for tribal law. She carried the original charter in a waterproof case, showed it to anyone who'd listen, trained 11 people over those years, dismissed 10 of them before graduation because they couldn't hold the standard she required. The 11th died in a raider ambush before taking the oath. By 2272, she'd stopped trying, wrote in her journal that the wasteland had changed too much, that the code required a kind of person the New World didn't produce anymore. She kept patrolling, kept enforcing what she could enforce alone, kept the title even though no one recognized it. In 2297, she walked into the divide and never came back. If you want the real history of the Desert Rangers, you'll have to piece it together yourself. There's Elise's audio logs in Vault 18, recorded between 2231 and 2241. Commander Ortega's field reports buried in NCR archives, covering 2241 to 2244. Reese's journal, recovered from a collapsed bunker in 2301, ends mid-sentence on the last page. The followers of the apocalypse spent 8 years cross-referencing every source they could find, interviewed 23 surviving Rangers and ex-Rangers, published a 340-page reconstruction in 2289. The NCR Military History Office published their own version in 2291, citing sources the followers never had access to. The conclusions contradicted each other on 47 major points. Holotapes degraded, witnesses died, stories got filed in the wrong archive, locked behind security clearances, or simply lost when a bunker collapsed. What's left is fragments, and every faction that touches those fragments reshapes them to fit the story they need. The problem was that every source told a different story. So the NCR did what governments always do with a useful ancestor. They cleaned him up. The Rangers became the noble frontier lawmen who tamed the Mojave, printed onto recruitment posters, and repeated in speeches, their rougher edges quietly sanded off. The killings that didn't fit the story got left out. The mistakes got reassigned to somebody else. Tribal storytellers went the other direction, turning individual Rangers into figures larger than any one person could have been, folding a dozen different men into a single wandering protector who was always in the right place at the right time. And the Wastelanders, who actually remembered them, they remembered fondly, which is its own kind of editing. Every group needed the Rangers to be something specific, so every group built the version it needed. The heroism got invented, the crimes got erased. Strip away the myth, and the history that remains is smaller and stranger. Here's what actually survives scrutiny. The Rangers formed sometime in the mid-22nd century, out of the chaos after the Master's army fell apart. That much nearly everyone agrees on. Give or take a decade nobody can pin down. There were battles, real ones, against raiders and slavers and the odd mutant warband, though the specific dates blur together and the casualty numbers shift depending on who's counting. There was a treaty with the young NCR. The moment the Rangers stopped being independent and started being an arm of somebody else's government. And there was Hoover Dam, where they fought under the two-headed bear for the first time in a way the history books could actually record. That's the skeleton. A founding, some fights, a merger, a famous battle. Lay it all out, end to end, and it's shockingly thin. The gaps in the record are larger than the record itself. Which brings us to the strangest wrinkle in the whole story, and it comes from a man who never wore the badge. His name was Randall Clark, and he lived alone in the Zion Canyons, decades before the Rangers existed, writing his thoughts into journals nobody was meant to read. He protected the survivors of a wagon train he'd never met. He hunted the raiders who threatened them, laid down rules for himself about who deserved mercy and who didn't, and carried the weight of every choice until it nearly broke him. He did all of it without a code handed to him, without an organization, without a single ranger anywhere in sight. One damaged old man, following the exact ethic the Rangers would later claim as their invention. If the desert can produce a Randall Clark on its own, with no training and no chain of command, then it raises the question the Rangers never wanted to answer. Were they ever actually needed? So, let's run the experiment. It's 2061, and the Desert Rangers never existed. What happens to the Mojave? The tribal confederations that formed anyway still form. The settlement networks that traded without ranger escorts keep trading. The warlords who got crushed by local militias still get crushed by local militias, because farmers with shotguns don't need a badge to defend their water. Freeside's kings would have organized their territory regardless. The followers of the apocalypse were already providing medical care and education before any ranger set foot in Vegas. The boomers isolated themselves without asking permission from anyone. Every settlement the Rangers claimed to protect had survived before the Rangers arrived and continued after they left. The Mojave's a self-correcting system. It produces its own Randall Clarks when it needs them, its own defenders, its own codes. The evidence suggests the wastes would have been fine, maybe better. Now, flip the question. What if the Desert Rangers had never merged with the NCR in 2271? What if they'd stayed independent, or just disbanded? The NCR expands east either way. That's not in question. But does it expand differently? The standard narrative says the Rangers civilized the Republic, that their code of honor tempered NCR aggression. The evidence doesn't support that. By 2281, the NCR is executing prisoners at Camp McCarran, running black site interrogations, forcibly annexing independent towns. All of this happens after the merger, with Rangers wearing NCR patches. If the Rangers were supposed to be a moral check on the Republic, they failed completely. A more brutal NCR might have actually been more honest. Imperialism without the pretense of justice. Expansion without the cover of a heroic legacy. The Rangers gave the NCR something more valuable than manpower. They gave it legitimacy. But there's one outcome that never gets discussed. What if the Desert Rangers didn't just fail to stop the NCR's corruption? What if they caused it? Here's the sequence. Pre-merger, the NCR is a republic, flawed but functional. It annexes territory, but it also builds infrastructure, establishes courts, creates something resembling civil society. Then the Rangers join in 2271, and within 10 years, the NCR is running extrajudicial killings and disappearing dissidents in the Mojave. The argument goes like this. The Rangers' mythology of righteous violence gave the NCR permission to abandon its own legal frameworks. Why bother with trials when you've got heroes who shoot first? Why maintain civilian oversight when the legendary Desert Rangers answer to military command? The merger didn't civilize the NCR, it militarized it. The Ranger Code became the excuse for every atrocity committed under the NCR flag in the East. We're the good guys. We're carrying on a noble tradition. So whatever we do must be justice. The most damning reading of the Desert Rangers is that they were the vector, the infection point where the Republic's ideals died and its imperial phase began. The Rangers' defenders point to one undeniable fact. In 2242, a Ranger patrol out of Shady Sands prevented a raider coalition from taking the hub. Estimated lives saved, 1,200. In 2251, Rangers enforced NCR water rights in the Mojave corridor, displacing 3 tribal communities. Estimated deaths from starvation and exposure over the following winter, 340. The ledger goes on for pages. Caravan routes protected, slaver camps burned, trade disputes that turned into occupations. Every intervention carries 2 columns. For every life the Rangers saved by stopping a warlord, there's a family caught in the crossfire when they stormed his compound. For every town they defended, there's a settlement that starved when NCR taxes followed the Rangers in. The optimistic accounting puts Ranger interventions at a net positive of 8,000 lives over 80 years. The pessimistic version, counting secondary effects and conflicts they prolonged, puts it at -2,000. The honest answer is, we'll never know, because half the wastes didn't keep records, and the other half burned them. The numbers don't settle the argument, they make it worse. The Ranger Code was written in 2159 by 11 men in a desert fort. It assumed conflicts would be local, enemies would be obvious, and Rangers would operate independently with no oversight but their own conscience. By 2241, Rangers were embedded in a military bureaucracy, enforcing policies written in shady sands, operating in regions where locals didn't speak their language. The code had no mechanism for collective accountability. If a ranger made a bad call, burned the wrong camp, or shot the wrong suspect, the code said his conscience would guide him. It didn't say what happened when his conscience was fine with it. It didn't say what happened when 6 rangers all made the same bad call, because they'd all learned from the same stories and the same teachers. The rigidity was the point. The code wasn't supposed to bend, because bending meant compromise, and compromise meant becoming what they'd fought against. But a code that can't adapt to new information is just fanaticism with better PR. The Rangers could admit mistakes individually, but the institution never could, because the institution was the code, and the code was infallible. Unless the code was never meant to succeed in the first place. The original Desert Rangers, the Nevada survivors who formed up in 2159, had one mission: protect settlements from raiders, slavers, and warlords until something better could take root. They were a stopgap, a transitional force. The code's second provision, rarely quoted, says Rangers will disband when law and order are restored. By 2241, law and order existed. It was called the NCR, and the Rangers were its forward scouts. The mission had shifted from protecting settlements to securing territory, from stopping slavers to enforcing tax collection, from temporary guardians to permanent enforcers. Every shift made sense in isolation. Caravans needed protection beyond NCR borders. Tribal raiders didn't respect surveyor marks. Someone had to keep the peace. But at some point, protection became occupation, and nobody remembers when. The Rangers themselves didn't see it, because each step felt like the logical next one. You don't betray your ideals all at once. You trade them, one, for things that feel more urgent. Security for flexibility, principles for results, the mission for the institution. Which brings us to the question that outlived the Rangers themselves. The question was simple on the surface. Did a group of armed volunteers have the right to decide what counted as justice across thousands of miles of wasteland they didn't live in, for communities they weren't part of, enforcing principles nobody had elected them to uphold? The Rangers never put it to a vote. They saw raiders burning a settlement and intervened. They found slavers and killed them. They walked into towns where local strongmen ruled through fear and removed those strongmen permanently. In their minds, some things didn't require permission. But the wastes had survived 2 centuries without them. Settlements had built their own defenses, negotiated their own treaties, made their own ugly compromises with the reality of scarce resources and armed neighbors. The Rangers arrived and declared all of that insufficient, sometimes wrong, occasionally evil. Were they saviors or just another gang with better PR? Defenders of the innocent or armed ideologues remaking the world in their image? Heroes or the wasteland's most successful cult? Every ranger who thought about it seriously reached a different conclusion. By the 2280s, if you asked wastelanders about the Desert Rangers, you got 100 different answers. In some towns, they were legends, the only reason grandparents were still alive to tell the story. In others, they were a cautionary tale about outsiders who thought they knew better. One family in the Mojave kept a ranger's badge in a lockbox. A gift from the man who'd rescued their great-grandmother from Legion scouts in 2231.3 miles away. Another family still cursed the Rangers who'd killed their grandfather in a firefight over suspected collaboration. Turned out he was just trading medicine. Some communities threw festivals on the anniversary of a Ranger intervention. Others had quietly scrubbed Ranger insignia off old buildings, painted over murals, stopped teaching the stories. The gratitude had a half-life, and 50 years was usually enough for it to decay into ambivalence. What you heard depended entirely on where you asked, who'd lived, who'd died, and which version of events had survived in the oral tradition. There was no consensus, no unified memory, no clear verdict. The pattern only becomes visible when you step back. The Desert Rangers weren't the first. Long before them, in the 2160s, the Brotherhood of Steel had sent paladins to protect wastelanders from super mutants and raiders. Before that, in the 2080s, scattered vault security teams had tried to impose order on the early wasteland. The scripts were almost identical. Stage 1, small group of idealists with superior training or technology sees innocent people suffering. Stage 2, they intervene, succeeding enough to build a reputation. Stage 3, success breeds growth, growth breeds structure, structure breeds politics. Stage 4, the mission becomes secondary to maintaining the institution. Stage 5, compromise, corruption, or collapse. The Brotherhood became techno-hoarders, hiding in bunkers. The vault security teams dissolved into warlord factions within a generation. The Desert Rangers made it further than most, held the principles longer, but the destination was the same. The wasteland had seen this loop 6 or 7 times by 2281, depending on how you counted. Each iteration believed it was different, that they'd learned from the previous failures, that their code was stronger or their cause more pure. Each iteration was wrong in approximately the same ways, and in the 2280s, the cycle is beginning again. In the Mojave, a ghoul named Hanlon has been protecting squatters in the Repcon facility for 9 years, asking nothing in return. In the Capital Wasteland, Riley's Rangers clear routes for caravans, using pre-war maps and coordinated fire teams. The Commonwealth has the Minutemen, rebuilt from a single survivor, and whatever settlers would answer the call. None of them wear the star. Most don't know the Desert Rangers ever existed, but they're solving the same problem, the one that won't go away, no matter how many times the answer collapses. Someone has to protect the people who can't protect themselves. The methods vary. Hanlon works alone. Riley's Rangers charge for their services. The Minutemen operate on pure volunteer coordination. No ranks, no pay, just whoever shows up when the flare goes up. None of these models have proven sustainable past a decade. History suggests they won't, but history also suggests they have to try. In the Texas wasteland, a group calling themselves the Desert Rangers patrol the ruins of San Antonio. They found a cache of NCR Ranger manuals in 2279 and reverse-engineered an organizational structure from supply requisition forms. Their leader wears a homemade star cut from a street sign. The Mojave regulators operate out of a fortified checkpoint on Highway 95, claiming direct descent from the original Rangers through a single ghoul member they refuse to let anyone meet. They charge 40 caps per traveler for safe passage and shoot anyone who doesn't pay. By their logic, they're providing the exact service the Rangers promised, just with transparent pricing. In Wyoming, a trading company has copyrighted the Ranger name and sells official commissions for 500 caps plus equipment. 160 people have bought in. The company takes 30% of all bounties collected. Legally, under the Articles of Incorporation filed with New Canaan in 2277, they are Desert Rangers. Whether they're real Rangers depends entirely on who you ask. The NCR's official history, published in 2281, credits the Rangers with regional peacekeeping efforts, before voluntary integration into a more effective governmental structure. It dedicates 11 pages to the Unification Treaty and 4 paragraphs to the preceding 80 years. The word coercion does not appear. The tribes tell it differently. In Zion, the dead horses preserve Randall Clark's story as oral tradition, the ranger as religious figure, the code as sacred text. In Arizona, hangdog oral history describes rangers as wandering judges who appeared when needed and vanished when the NCR arrived, never defeated, simply gone. Both versions are incompatible with documented events. The followers of the apocalypse have been reconstructing ranger history from primary sources since 2276. Interviews with surviving members, comparison of conflicting accounts, archaeological surveys of abandoned ranger stations. Their working draft identifies 47 major contradictions they cannot resolve. Publication has been delayed 4 times. Meanwhile, the popular version, the one in campfire stories and trader gossip, keeps simplifying. The rangers become purely heroic or purely fraudulent, depending on who's telling it. The code becomes either perfect wisdom or obvious foolishness. The ending becomes either tragic betrayal or inevitable failure. The version that wins will determine what justice means in the next century. We'll never know who led the Rangers through the Tucson Uprising in 2237. The records burned with the outpost. We'll never know how many civilians died in the Phoenix Suppression Campaign, because 3 different sources give 3 different numbers, and none of them cite their methodology. We'll never know what happened to Captain Sarah Mendez after she disappeared in 2252, whether she deserted or died, or just walked into the wasteland and kept going. The NCR vaults still hold 14 crates of Ranger documents seized during the Unification Treaty negotiations, classified indefinitely. Senator Aradesh's staff promised a 50-year declassification timeline in 2271. That deadline passed 10 years ago. The boxes haven't moved. We'll never get the full accounting of the Flagstaff incident because the only surviving witness died in 2268, and the Ranger After-Action Report is one of those 14 crated files. We'll never know if the Rangers had contingency plans for resisting annexation, because if they did, nobody's talking. We'll never know how many Desert Rangers actually existed at any given time, because the organization never published rosters, and the estimates range from 340 to over 2,000. But there's one question that matters more than the rest. Did they believe it? When a ranger rode into a settlement wearing that badge, when they delivered that speech about law and order and the code, when they executed a raider chief, or negotiated a water treaty, or burned down a slaver camp, were they acting on genuine conviction or just playing the role that kept them in power? You can find arguments either way in the archives. The Rangers who joined the NCR peacefully, who kept trying to make the system work, who trained the next generation and passed down the code, they suggest belief, real belief. The Rangers who enriched themselves, who bent the rules for friends, who walked away when the NCR came calling, they suggest something colder, a useful fiction maintained as long as it served. Chief Elise kept a personal journal that the Hoover Dam Museum acquired in 2279. One entry from 2271 reads, "We were never saints, we were just the ones willing to do the job." Another entry, 3 months later, "Maybe that's what saints are, people who do the job anyway." She crossed that second line out, but not enough to make it unreadable. The evidence points in both directions, and that might be the most honest answer we'll ever get. Here's what they left behind that nobody can take away. The idea that justice in the wasteland doesn't have to mean whoever's strongest wins. That power without limits becomes tyranny, even when it starts with good intentions. That someone has to enforce the rules, even when the rules are imperfect, even when enforcement is dangerous, even when nobody's watching. The NCR inherited that framework. and built a republic on it. The Mojave Rangers kept the name and the mission when they could have just become another military unit. Every settlement council that writes down their laws instead of leaving everything to a strong man's mood, every caravan guard who refuses a bribe to look the other way, every wasteland community that expects their protectors to answer for their actions, they're echoing something the Desert Rangers put into the world. It's not a perfect legacy. The Rangers failed often, and sometimes catastrophically, but the idea survived the organization. The notion that the wasteland can have laws that matter, that bind the powerful as well as the weak, that apply even when inconvenient. That's still out there, still circulating, still shaping how people think about what justice should look like. Whether that idea survives depends on what happens next. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Ranger model might not be broken implementation. It might be structurally impossible given the wasteland's economics. When there's one functioning water pump for 300 people, whoever controls that pump controls everything. The strong take, the weak die. Justice becomes a luxury no one can afford, because survival takes every calorie, every bullet, every hour of daylight. Protection without exploitation requires surplus. You need enough food that a town can spare some to feed its defenders, enough safety that people can think past tomorrow, enough stability that fairness matters more than the next meal. The Desert Rangers wanted to be different. They tried to build justice in a world with nothing to spare, and the wasteland killed them for it, because the wasteland kills everything soft. Maybe they were always doomed. Maybe the only factions that survive are the ones willing to exploit, to hoard, to rule. Maybe the Ranger ideal can only ever be held by a permanent minority, waiting for a world that will never come, unless scarcity itself is the thing that changes. What if the Rangers were just early? What if the problem was never the principle, but the timing? The wasteland of 2080 was hell, radiation everywhere, crops failing, trade routes controlled by raiders with pre-war weapons. By 2180, you've got the hub running caravans, Shady Sands farming Brahmin, the gun runners making new ammunition. By 2280, the NCR's got taxes and courts and a currency people actually trust. Slow, bloody, uneven, but it's reconstruction. Towns that were killing each other over a barrel of clean water are now arguing about tariffs. That's progress. That's the material base changing. The Rangers tried to enforce fairness when there wasn't enough to be fair with. 200 years later, there's more. Not plenty, not everywhere, but more. Enough that some communities can afford to think about justice instead of just survival. Enough that protecting the weak stops being suicidal charity and starts being sustainable policy. The data from the 2300s is ambiguous, but there are signs. Water purifiers in the capital wasteland, Hoover Dam powering New Vegas and the Mojave, the Prydwen's onboard hydroponics. These aren't just tech, they're the foundation justice gets built on. When a settlement's got reliable water, they stop fighting over the well. When they've got power, they can run medical equipment, refrigeration, communications. When they've got food surplus, they can support specialists like teachers, medics, and lawmen who don't have to shake down civilians to eat. The Institute was working on synthetic agriculture. The Brotherhood's scribes are cataloging pre-war infrastructure for restoration. The Minutemen rebuilt the castle and got settlements trading with each other. None of it's enough yet. None of it's everywhere. But the trend line is real. The wasteland's still brutal, but it's less brutal than it was in 2077. Less than 2100. Less than 2200. Every functional reactor, every clean aquifer, every hectare of arable land reclaimed shifts the equation. Makes cooperation a little more viable. Makes exploitation a little less necessary. Makes the idea that you could protect people without owning them a little less insane. in a world with enough, the Ranger Code might finally work. Step back far enough, and the Desert Rangers become something else entirely. Not heroes or failures, but a 70-year experiment in protecting people without controlling them. One specific answer to one specific moment in wasteland history. They rose when the Mojave had just enough water, just enough trade, just enough stability to make voluntary cooperation possible, when communities could afford to feed protectors instead of warlords, when the math of survival allowed for something better than tyranny. They fell when that window closed, when drought and war made resources too scarce for idealism, when bigger powers with bigger armies redrew the map. The Rangers didn't fail their code. The conditions that made their code workable simply ended. History hasn't delivered a verdict yet, because history isn't finished with the question. The NCR's success or failure in the Mojave will rewrite what the Rangers meant. The next drought or the next treaty will add another chapter. As of 2310, new caravans crossed the Mojave under new protectors. This story isn't over. But the code itself survived in ways the Desert Rangers never planned for. Carved into the walls of Ranger Station Echo, taught by tribal elders in the northern valleys who still remember when a ranger's word meant safety. Copied into follower archives in 4 different settlements across Nevada and Arizona. The New Canaan missionaries carried versions of it east before their city burned. A merchant caravan out of the hub uses a modified ranger oath for its guards. 3 independent towns in the northern Mojave still fly the old star, long after the organization that made it is gone. It's not an organization anymore. It's text, memory, a set of principles separated from the people who wrote them. The idea that you can protect without owning, serve without ruling, enforce justice without becoming the law. Whether that's enough is the test the wasteland is running right now. An idea preserved is not an idea practiced. Words on a wall don't stop raiders or settle water disputes, but they do give people a frame for what protection could look like if anyone had the discipline to try it again. Whether words on a wall can change the world is still being tested. So who actually inherits what the Desert Rangers built? The NCR Rangers wear the name and the armor. They carry the guns, patrol the same roads, use the same stations. They claim direct succession through the Unification Treaty of 2271. But they serve a republic. They answer to senators and generals. They enforce laws written in shady sands, not community agreements negotiated in the Mojave. They're excellent soldiers and honorable protectors, but they're not independent. They're not the original model. The independents, the holdouts who refused unification, they live closer to the code. Small groups protecting single communities, taking no orders from distant capitals. But there's maybe 40 of them left across 4 states, and half are over 60. They kept the structure, but lost the scale. Then there are the wastelanders who just remember, who tell their children about the time Rangers cleared the raiders from Red Rock, who keep the star painted on the general store, who use Ranger justice as shorthand for fairness, even though no Ranger has been through their town in 30 years. They kept the meaning, but lost the mechanism. All 3 claim it. None have earned it yet. So here's what the Desert Rangers were. An experiment in whether justice could survive without a state backing it. For 77 years, the answer was yes. Then it was no. They saved thousands of lives, built 14 settlements, held a region together through famine and raids and the collapse of everything familiar. They did it with 300 people at their peak. No taxes, no artillery, no supply lines from anywhere but each other. And they lost, not because they were corrupt or cruel or cowardly, but because noble isn't enough. Because eventually the math catches up, the ammunition runs out, and the raiders have more people than you have bullets. The NCR inherited the name. The Mojave chapter kept the oath. The tradition survived in pieces, scattered across 2 states and 100 years. But the Rangers themselves? Gone in 2271, along with the idea that a handful of good people with rifles could be enough. That's the legacy. Not that they failed, but that they proved it was possible at all. If you want more Fallout history, the whole archive is here. Thanks for watching.